This is Jonathan Angulo on July 30th, 2025 at 11:22 a.m. at Stanford's Hoover Institute, conducting an interview for the Global Oral History of PEPFAR project. To begin, could you start off by introducing yourself?
I'm Kenneth Bernard. I'm a retired Rear Admiral in the U.S. Public Health Service and former Assistant Surgeon General.
Perfect. Please briefly tell us about yourself and your family. Where and when were you born? Where did you go to school, etc.?
Well, I was born in the East Bay in California, near San Francisco. I was raised by a law enforcement family. My father was an inspector in the DA's office in Alameda County, and I grew up in San Leandro, California, and went to Berkeley, got a degree in tropical studies. I think I'm the only person to ever get a degree in tropical studies from the University of California, Berkeley. I then went to medical school at UC Davis. Following that, I went to the London School of Tropical Medicine and came back, finished my internal medicine residency after that. I've been married twice. My first wife had 3 kids, and she has since passed away. I'm married again, and I now have multiple sets of stepchildren and grandchildren.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. I wanted to kind of explore a little bit about what drew you to medicine, and in particular, maybe telling us a little bit about what influenced you to start your career in public health.
My mother was raised in a Jewish family, so the options for my career were narrow. You can be a lawyer or a doctor or something less important. So I chose not to be a lawyer, but to actually go into medicine. And honestly, it seemed like an exciting thing to do. And back in the day when I was at Berkeley, this was during late 60s, early 70s, when there was lots of social unrest and anti-war demonstrations and such. It seemed like a good thing to do. I could go out and help people. And so in those days, it was very easy to get into medical school. All you needed was a 3.4 grade point average, and they had to let you into the University of California School of Medicine in the University of California system. This was before the tax laws changed and the university system became less funded. Mm-hmm. So it was very easy. It didn't require me to even be a great student, although I was okay.
So can you tell us a little bit about starting your career in public health as a viral disease epidemiologist at the CDC? Around what years did that occur?
When I came back from London, and I got exposed to really interesting international stuff related to global health issues at the London School of Tropical Medicine. I had to finish my internal medicine residency, so I went back to Oregon to finish that residency. And after a couple of years of taking care of sick people, I decided, maybe this isn't how I want to spend the rest of my career. So I decided that public health would be an interesting alternative, especially given my tropical medicine training. And so I applied to the Centers for Disease Control and became an epidemic intelligence officer at the CDC for 3 years. And then my career just started off from that. I started off in the viral diseases division. And while I was there, I investigated the death of a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa of rabies. And this Peace Corps volunteer had been immunized with the brand new rabies vaccine. Nobody had ever gotten rabies who had gotten this rabies vaccine. And yet she died of rabies in Nairobi. And I was sent over by CDC to figure out why. So I spent months in Kenya back and forth investigating the cause of death and why somebody who had been vaccinated for rabies still got rabies. So with regards to that particular case, that expanded my involvement with the non-technical medical issues related to global health. The reason that she got rabies was that she was in a village where she adopted a puppy given to her by the chief in the village because she was so lonely. And the dogs in Africa obviously aren't immunized all the time, and that dog got exposed to a wild animal and got rabies. She got exposed to the dog, and I found her diary. And so I could track day by day her getting the dog getting sick, her exposing herself to the dog, her getting sick, and it was all tracked in her personal diary. So the reason that she died was because she had been vaccinated while in Africa. And we determined that if you're going to vaccinate American kids, do it while their immune systems aren't being assaulted by 1,000 other new things after they get to Africa. So it changed Peace Corps policies to vaccinate all their volunteers in their home country, in the United States, before sending them overseas, because it didn't look like they responded well to vaccines if they had just arrived in a new country where they had a lot of new infections and different foods, etc.
Yeah, it's super interesting, especially thinking about some of the questions you get when you go to your physician, as a child, and about overseas travel, right? It makes me think about that. So can you give us a little bit more, right? You talk about your experience with the Peace Corps into these transitions, working for the Office of International Health, Health and Human Services, and then later on to the International Health Policy Advisor to the Director of the U.S. Peace Corps.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I was at CDC in the International Health Office there, which I moved into after doing this big Africa thing because it seemed like the good place. And they liked me there, and I was working at CDC as a staff person, young staff scientist. And the Peace Corps director called and said, "We were really pleased with the fact that a CDC person helped solve one of our problems. Can you assign somebody to the Peace Corps to be their epidemiologist for the whole Peace Corps, 5,000 young people in 60 countries. It was a big group of Americans overseas. And my boss at the time said, sure. So I became the Peace Corps epidemiologist troubleshooter for 4 years. But I lived in Atlanta, and I only had to go up to Washington to the Peace Corps office now and then to brief the director. Lots of interesting trips overseas, lots of interesting issues, and a lot of them, again, were not technical health issues. They were things like violence. There were things like sexual assault. How do you tell a parent who sends their child off to the Peace Corps that their daughter was sexually assaulted, and whose responsibility is it to protect those kids who are out in villages, sometimes hundreds of miles from the big cities? Became a lot of very interesting issues that involve things other than just what's your temperature, do you have malaria, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and absolutely, I can think about going through the diary, finding out that it was the puppy, right, and kind of like outside the box thinking, right, that you're talking about.
Exactly.
So I know that this was a very, the time period, right, that you were through your career, and it was right around the time of the major emergence of HIV and AIDS as a global pandemic. I wonder if you can talk about your understanding of the virus evolved while you were doing this public health work.
Right. Well, this was in the mid-'80s, right? So this was originally, I had been assigned as a young viral disease scientist to the original group at CDC that were looking into this weird disease that was occurring among gay men and Haitians, if you recall. And I was assigned to the original study group at CDC that was chaired by somebody from the parasitology office, because at the time they thought it might be a parasite that was causing this immune deficiency back in 1981. And so I went to a few meetings and I said, if I stay working with this, it's going to be my career. And I said, not going to do that. So I gave up my spot as the viral disease division person to this committee and went off and did the international health kinds of things. Regarding HIV and the Peace Corps, that was when I was working with the Peace Corps, and I wrote a paper for the director. Lorette Miller-Rupe was the director at the time, really wonderful Peace Corps director. And she wanted me to write a paper on the risk of HIV to the Peace Corps volunteers. And I took it in, and the risks were substantial because a lot of these volunteers are in Africa. And so it was becoming a crisis in Africa, big crisis. And so I wrote a paper for her on what we needed to do and the surveillance and the education and all. And I immediately took it into her, and she took one look at it and turned to her assistant and said, "You need to classify this. I don't want anybody to hear about this." And I said, "But I don't have security clearance." And I wrote it. What I don't understand. And she said, "You're not allowed to talk about it. This is something we need to keep internally, because otherwise the Peace Corps there'll be panic among Peace Corps volunteers, and especially their families." So that was my first introduction to HIV was back in '81 when they first set up the committee at CDC. And then when I went to the Peace Corps, this was the second instance of having to deal with HIV. But it was expanding throughout the 80s and 90s, and it affected everything. You always had to consider HIV as a background to exposures to any diseases, because of course there was no treatment, no prevention other than by habit, personal behavior. And it was pretty scary because everybody died, right?
Yeah.
It was like rabies, you know. There's hardly anybody who's ever survived rabies, a couple of people who survived rabies after actually becoming clinically ill. So HIV at that time was the same.
So, you know, you directly writing this paper and order to, you know, have this classified. Like, how did that feel? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it made me understand that policy, it was my first understanding that people who are in charge of big policy, science is only 20 or 30% of the information necessary to make policy decisions, even about a science issue. There are so many more other issues involved. This one was about the social issue of concern and panic about at the time, incurable disease that we, as the United States government Peace Corps program, was exposing young people to. And what were we going to do about it? It wasn't so much about the individual volunteers, how do we treat their HIV? Of course, they would have been immediately sent home and dealt with separately. It was about what's the public health response as the Peace Corps to the science of what HIV was. And I think that's the thing that shocked me. And it impelled me to get a security clearance as quickly as I could manage doing that, because you can't do policy in anything international or anything related to security without a security clearance, because so much of the information is held closely.
Mm-hmm. No, right. So from 1994 to 1998, you served as the International Health Attaché and Senior Representative to the U.S. Secretary of Health at the U.S. mission to the UN in Geneva.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about that role and what it entailed? And if you think I may have missed something during that transition, you can also speak to that.
Well, at first I went from the Peace Corps to the Office of International Health at Health and Human Services, and I worked under a woman named Rose Belmont there, who had been there for 40 years, I think, and she was the desk officer for the U.S. relations with the World Health Organization. And I worked in that office learning about the World Health Organization, how the U.S. interacted with it. We were the biggest funder. We paid 25% of its budget. It was a very important international institution, an institution we have since withdrawn from in the last 6 months. But at the time, it was a very, very important point of intersection with international health and the U.S. government. So I learned about the organization, went over to Geneva many times with the office because we were the U.S. government oversight office for the World Health Organization. And we have had for many years, the Public Health Service and actually Health and Human Services overall has had a health attaché, a person assigned to the U.S. mission to the United Nations in Geneva to deal with day-to-day activities with WHO. And so after being there a couple of years in the Office of International Health, I moved over to Geneva and spent 4 years working there, learning health diplomacy. And at the time, one of the big issues was for the US was replacing the current Director General of the World Health Organization, who was Hiroshi Nakajima from Japan, with somebody better.
Mm-hmm.
And
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you, for the lay people listening, tell us what health diplomacy is? You just used that phrase, and I would love to get it defined for us.
well, health diplomacy is the interaction of governments or big institutions, multilateral institutions like WHO or the UN, on issues of policy that are mutually interactive. So, for example, if the United Kingdom has a recommendation for polio immunization for children, we might have an interaction with them to make sure that our recommendations as a government are compatible or mutually reinforceable. The same thing happens with the UN. We want to make sure that WHO's recommendations for the 194 countries that are members are compatible with US recommendations. And they're not always the same, but we want to make sure that they're not counter to each other, so we have to end up arguing about who's right and who's wrong. So it's like diplomacy with everything else. It just happens to be specific to public health more than things like arms control or border security.
Mm-hmm. And kind of expanding on that, you know, what was your experience with, for example, health diplomacy and HIV/AIDS during your time there?
Well, fascinating time, because in the early 90s, all the UN agencies had their own HIV/AIDS departments. UNDP, United Nations Development Program, UNICEF, WHO, plus every country themselves, USAID in the United States, DFID, the USAID equivalent in the UK, all had their own recommendations. And at the time, WHO was trying to take the lead in making public health recommendations internationally for HIV/AIDS. And Michael Merson, who unfortunately died in a horrible plane crash, the Pan Am plane crash where the plane went down, forget exactly when, but while he was still working as a really important person in international HIV/AIDS. In any event, he was having a huge argument with the Director General, Hiroshi Nakajima, about how to manage all the various interests related to HIV, and he ended up resigning from WHO at the time. And then WHO was having arguments with especially UNICEF and UNDP about what would be the best recommendations, who should be the lead UN agency. So finally, the member governments in 1994 got completely fed up with this because there were too many personalities involved, and there were strong personalities on HIV in every organization. So WHO put forward the international community forced WHO to put forward a recommendation to create a new agency, UNAIDS, to deal solely with AIDS in the international community and to be the focal point so that UNDP wasn't competing with WHO, et cetera. And in those years, it required each of the agencies to pass a resolution by their governing bodies agreeing to a new format for a new agency. And it required the member governments to agree to fund it, to attend the meetings. It was creating a new UN agency out of whole cloth. And it was forced on WHO and UNDP and UNICEF against their will because the donors were sick and tired of the arguing among the various UN agencies. And interestingly enough, I don't know whether you know, David Nabarro, who just died, I think last week, was the representative from DFID, the USAID, Agency for International Development, equivalent in England. And he was the health person there. And he was attending one of these meetings. And in 1994, and there was a complete breakdown of agreement. It was a stalemate. And David Nabarro, brilliant, brilliant man. Difficult, you know, kind of the Steve Jobs of international health. Difficult but brilliant. Came into the room having not heard anything about the negotiations which have been going on for days and days and days to create this new agency. And he sat down behind the UK placard and said, turned around and said, "What's the problem?" And the people around him said, "Here's what the problem is." He opened up his computer, he typed 2 or 3 sentences. He raised the UK placard and said, you know, "Madam Chairman," or "Mr. Chairman," I forget which one it was. I think it was Mr. Chairman. "I think I may have a solution." He read his language for the resolution. Everybody turned around and looked at everybody and said, "Yeah, that works for me. Yeah, that works for me." He closed his computer and got up and walked out of the room. That was it. He walked in and in 10 minutes solved a problem that people had been arguing about for days. And that's how UNAIDS got formed. 2 years later, 96, I think, it was actually formally created, but it took several years of doing that. So that's how the governance of UNAIDS and the UNAIDS program that we know today actually got formed.
And what would you say, you saw this play out in real time,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say was your evaluation and how effective UNAIDS was? After, and I know you were there from 1994 to 1998, but from 1996 to 1998?
Marginally. Because they made, I think, a critical error that the United States helped to fix. And the PEPFAR program actually did fix, or predominantly really helped fix the problem. At the time, all the AIDS groups were talking about the best dollars spent, right? You have a minimum number of dollars to spend, and you have a disease that potentially is killing millions of people around the world. I mean, remember at the time, 1/3 of African adults in Southern and Eastern Africa were infected. They all died. They all left thousands of children unsupervised, uncared for. It was a disaster in Africa, because there was no treatment, really. And when there was treatment, eventually, in the mid-90s, there was no money, because at the time, the cost of treating HIV was tens of thousands of dollars per patient. You couldn't treat villages in Africa with that. Who was going to come up with the money? So the problem with public health people is they think about public health the way they were trained, which is prevention. But if you recall, when I was talking about the Peace Corps earlier and policy, science being only a part of the problem of international health policy making, people weren't listening to the messages. You know, WHO and UNDP and UNICEF were spending money trying to educate people on safe sex. And they weren't listening. Now, it's interesting, as we've discovered, the people they listened to the most were the local healers, the local religious leaders, the local leaders. But if you dropped somebody in from WHO or UNICEF from New York and they're white and arrogant and they come in and they say, "You people need to start having safe sex, we're handing out condoms," and this kind of thing. It's like, really? And I think that was the biggest failure of the initial attempt to control HIV. We had no vaccine. We had no drugs that were affordable in Africa, and even after, until the late 90s, even, you know, for the first 15 years, we had nothing. And I think it was, the only thing they had that they could use was education, and it was just not as effective as it could have been.
And so you would say that that's why it was marginal, the UNA AIDS, in the way public health administrators globally were kind of doing,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
I mean, I don't blame them. What are you going to do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, with COVID, they locked down the United States. They didn't do it because they thought it was the right thing to do. They did it because there was no other option when people were filling emergency rooms in New York City to the point where they couldn't take any more patients. It's like, we can't deal with this anymore. So what they did wasn't wrong. It was just not sufficient.
So now we're kind of moving a little bit towards your transition into the Clinton administration, which began around August 1998. And you served as President Clinton's NSC, in his NSC staff, as a special advisor to the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. You were the first person to have this job.
Yep.
Can you tell us about stepping into this brand new role, and also as well, like, speak to the experience that you had and how it made you the ideal candidate for this role?
Well, here's kind of what happened. When I was in Geneva as the health attaché, Secretary Donna Shalala had been the Secretary of Health for the entire Clinton administration. And she was really good. We had a good relationship. She used to come to Geneva to the Health Assembly at the World Health Organization. I knew her fairly well professionally. And as I was finishing my 4 years in Geneva, they rotate out 3 or 4 years, they rotate a new person in. I was thinking, where do I want to go next? Well, I'd been bitten by the international health policy and security bug, and I decided I need to help create a role for myself in the US government where I can take advantage of what I've learned. So I called her up and I said, Madam Secretary, the following 6 issues are very important to you. I think we can make advances in these international health issues better if we have a seat at the National Security Council, where the real foreign policy and national security decisions are made. If we have a seat there, your voice will be heard day to day there rather than during a cabinet meeting, for example. And Donna Shalala was really smart. And she said, you are exactly right. And oh, by the way, I know Sandy Berger. We worked on the campaign together. He was the National Security Advisor. I'm calling Sandy. Literally the next day, she said, when you leave Geneva, you're going to the National Security Council. Sandy Berger's opening an office for you to do health and security. And so there I went. And so I showed up there during the last 2 years, the end of the Clinton administration. And the hard part after getting there was convincing anybody other than Sandy Berger that health was a security issue. Because public health people, being their own worst enemies sometimes, would say, oh, well, important security people, the National Security Advisor can't make a public health decision because they're not trained in it. The president really needs to be informed by the health people before he makes a decision because we understand how this all works. But what they didn't understand was that important decisions are always made by the most important people. And if you tell an important person, the National Security Advisor, or the president, or the cabinet member, that they don't have the competence to make an important decision, what do? They downgrade the importance of the decision because if it were important, they would be making it. And public health people never, well, they're getting better at it, but they almost never get that. What you want at the White House is somebody who has no training in health to decide that a health issue is important. Because health has to wait in line behind lots of other national security issues. You know, Middle East peace, the war in the Ukraine. Those are important issues. Health doesn't just get to go to the front of the line because the public health people say it's killing people, a disease is killing people. So what I did, I first showed up at the NSC for the first time. Anybody had been doing health policy at the NSC. And I put my, Dr. Kenneth Bernard, MD, DT, M&H, internal medicine stuff on my door plaque. Not a single person called me or came in for 3 weeks to see even why I was there. They assumed I was a doctor taking care of people. The first person to come into my office was a Marine guard who'd sprained his ankle on a jog that morning and came in and thought that I could take care of it for him. And I said, I don't do that. You have to go to the medical office. The White House had a medical office. They said, oh, but it says on your door. So that changed everything. I took all of my degrees. I put Kenneth Bernard, special advisor to the National Security Advisor for Health and Security. Then people started paying attention to me because they assumed I was a policy person, not a technical expert. And if you want to make policy decisions, the policy decisions are literally never made, almost never, made by a health technical expert. Except maybe the director of CDC, maybe the director of NIH. But those are only specific to health things. They don't involve usually much broader policy. Now, the exception to that, of course, is CDC, which is why you're seeing all of these problems with the ACIP and immunization recommendations, because those are policy decisions, and the policy people don't like it when CDC makes policy decisions that disagree with their intended policy. So they ended up having to turn the director of CDC into a political position, just like the director of NIH. It was the only way they could control the policy decision of the public health community.
Right. And I kind of want to ask you about you making these really important reflections as you're stepping into the NSC. Can you tell us a little bit about how you were able to shift that perspective in the NSC about taking health policy serious?
Here's the way we had to do it. We couldn't talk about people dying in Africa. At one point, I got to go to the senior staff meetings chaired by the National Security Advisor. That's pretty cool. It's in the Situation Room, in the basement of the White House, and it's very cool. Of course, I had to sit in the second row because there were much more important people sitting in the front row. But if you recall, back in the year, I think in 2000, a Russian submarine called the Kursk sank in the Barents Sea, and the United States offered to provide assistance in saving the people in the Russian submarine, and the Russians turned it down because they didn't want their submarine looked at by Americans. So they all died. I think 118 people died. We talked about that during staff meetings at the NSC multiple times. One morning before I went into one of those Monday morning staff meetings, I got a cable that the king of Swaziland was speaking to the big soccer stadium full of Swazi citizens, that 30% of you are infected with HIV and you're going to die. You need to make arrangements for your children. And I got this cable from USAID in Swaziland, and I read this. And so I said, this is important enough to raise at a National Security Council meeting. So I tentatively raised my hand for the first time probably and said, Mr. Berger, I'd like to read this thing, this cable I got this morning. So after spending 40 minutes talking about the Kursk and 118 Russian sailors, I read this, and we're talking about 1/3 like 300,000 people who had just been told they're going to die in Swaziland. And I said, I read this, and I said, this is a national security issue. And there was dead silence in the room. No one knew what to say, because nobody had ever really considered a issue like this a national security issue. These people were trained at Johns Hopkins, various, or the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown or the Kennedy School. They're used to binational, chest-thumping, confrontational politics, us and them power stuff. And this is like, we don't do this. But think of the magnitude of what happened. The way I got them to pay attention was not to talk about the number of people who were dying, but the potential security issues of destabilization of governments, because young men could join militias or terrorist groups because they had no other way to feed themselves. So if you're talking about tens of thousands of teenage boys trying to feed themselves, and the potential for militias, criminal militias, or terrorist groups saying, come with us, we'll feed you. That's how I got their attention, about having to do with regional, political, and military destabilization. Because you have to talk to security people the way security people talk to each other. I once went, a little bit later on in my, when I was at the White House and the Bush administration, I went to talk to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all of the service chiefs, all the 4 stars in charge of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to talk about bioterrorism and risks, etc. And I said, more people died in the 20th century from smallpox than all the wars of the 20th century combined, including civilian deaths, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam War, the War on Terror. And one of the service chiefs turned and said, son, I was pretty young looking and he was not, it looks like we did a pretty damn good job in the 20th centuries and you health people didn't. Which was a critical change on approach to health and security. And that is, just because people are dying and you think it's important, it doesn't mean that everybody else does. They view their job as protecting America and fighting wars. Your job is to keep people from dying from disease. You can't turn your job into my job just because a lot of people die. You need to do your job better.
Yeah, that's a terrific story about how you were able to do that. I wanted to kind of ask you a follow-up question about, you found the story in Swaziland and the effect of HIV and AIDS in Swaziland and how much of the population was going to die of that, and posing that as a national security threat. Building on that, how did you then move to the next step about, got the attention of these folks, how do I inform them about HIV and AIDS being the public health concern?
Well, the nice thing about it is President Clinton loved dealing with these issues. And he, I think, put together a program in 1999, I think, called the LIFE program, which was leadership in HIV AIDS. I forget the exact description, what a program was. And there was a woman that was doing domestic AIDS, Sandra Thurman. She was the director of the Office of National AIDS Policy back in the Clinton administration. And so I had to work with her, and I had to work with Gail Smith, who was the senior director for Africa at the time. She eventually went on to be administrator of USAID in the Biden administration. I mean, in the Obama administration, I think. And with Susan Rice, remember, who ended up being the National Security Advisor also, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs at the time. So you had Sandra Thurman, Susan Rice, and Gail Smith, a triumvirate of women, really smart policy women, that were basically in charge of Africa and AIDS overall. And I was this upstart young guy from the NSC coming in and opening an office at the NSC dealing just with health and security. So it was a bit of a disruption of their group. But an interesting story, there was a story that Sandra Thurman was invited to talk about national security issues with the NSC, and she had to ask where the Situation Room was because, people who do health, especially domestic health, don't go to the Situation Room. They don't deal with national security issues. She got involved, and she traveled to Africa and got involved. But I was asked by Leon Firth, who was the National Security Advisor to the Vice President Gore, who was clearly the heir apparent, right, for the election, to put together a national security-related plan for HIV/AIDS, which I did, and Sandra Thurman was doing one in parallel, which was not associated with the National Security Council as much as with the Office of National and AIDS Policy and the more domestic side of things. Interesting story, Sandra Thurman put together a international AIDS program and sent it to the president without going through the national security apparatus because she had a different reporting. She went through the domestic policy advisor, not the national security advisor to the president. Well, the president got this national plan, international plan from her and put bunches of notes on it like he was wont to do onto the paper. And at the top said to his assistant, please return this to Sandy. Well, the assistant saw Sandy and thought it was Sandy Berger, not Sandy Thurman. Mm. So the Sandy Thurman's international AIDS plan went to the National Security Advisor, not the domestic policy advisor. Sandy Berger flipped out. He said, wait, what do you mean I haven't seen this? And they had words, and then things kind of leveled out a little bit. But there was always a competition in the Clinton administration. Clinton was really, really good at emphasizing the issues, talking about them. The G8 in Okinawa, he said, push at the G8. We need a lot of health issues at the G8 on HIV/AIDS. He was really good on the issues. The problem was Congress was not really good at funding them. So his last year in office only had $460 million appropriated for international AIDS. I mean, $460 million is less than it costs to run the city of Baltimore for 2 weeks. I mean, we're talking really seriously constrained budgets. All the words were right, but the funding didn't support all of the policies.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about, you're giving out a figure about the money spent globally on HIV/AIDS. I kind of want to take it, this might be a little bit too policy specific, but can you tell me about, you're thinking about forming global public health policy and targeting HIV and AIDS, but can you tell me a little bit about maybe the importance about the Ryan White CARE Act and thinking about how that could be a model maybe, or not a model?
Ryan White was done entirely by the domestic people at the White House. I had nothing to do with it. I know as much about it as you do.
Okay, well that's fair.
Yeah. I actually know a little bit about it, but I'm not the right person to talk about it. The big change with how we dealt with international came with Senator Bill Frist, who was also a doctor. When back in 2000 during the G8, the President Clinton asked for us to really push HIV/AIDS. The Japanese, who were hosting it, were really interested in malaria. So we went off to Okinawa, and we did spend a lot of time talking about how we can come up with an initiative for the G8 that meet the Japanese political need to deal with malaria and the US political need to deal with HIV/AIDS, because that's what the administrations wanted. So we came up with the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis, the idea for that. And the reason why its AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis is: one, Clinton wanted AIDS; two, Japan wanted malaria, and we had to figure out how to make it narrow enough that the funding wouldn't get diluted to the point of not being effective. So we had to come up with a rationale to not include diarrheal diseases, pneumonia, measles, all these other diseases. So what we did was we thought, what's unique enough about AIDS and malaria, and we could maybe find one or two other diseases to add to it. So we came up with the idea that what diseases kill more than 1 million people a year for which there's no vaccine? And single diseases, not diseases like diarrheal diseases, but single diseases. And it was AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. And we said, perfect, because TB was a common thing that happened with people with HIV, so there was a connection. The Japanese insisted on malaria, so that was a non-starter. It was their G8. And so the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and TB came about as a result of the G8 in Okinawa. And the reasons it came about with those 3 diseases are not for any other reason than what I just said. It was politics. Mm-hmm. Then Richard Holbrooke, our ambassador to the UN at the end of the Clinton administration, decided that he cared about HIV in Africa. Really smart guy. Impossible personality to deal with. Another brilliant person like David Nabarro, who, his way or the highway, and just stay out of his way. If he's going that way, you better be going with him. And he thought, rightly so, that HIV/AIDS was very important for our international connections and development assistance. He had the full support of the president, and he became the president of or the head of each member of the Security Council in New York. They rotate between the 5 members of the Security Council as who's the chairman, who's running it, who sets the agenda every year. And it was his turn to run the Security Council. And so he put HIV/AIDS on the agenda. And there was an uproar among the other countries, the other Perm 5, the Security Council. And it was, this is not a security issue. And Richard Holbrooke just beat everybody up and said, I don't care what you think. It is a security issue. These are the reasons we're having a National Security Council meeting on AIDS as a security issue in January 2000. And it's on the agenda because I'm setting the agenda. And there was grumbling, and the Chinese didn't want it, and it was, So they did it anyway, and the way they did it is they had Al Gore, the vice president, sit in the U.S. chair during the meeting, which of course raised the profile. And our ambassador of the UN was there, and Holbrooke had parties and social events, and they had side meetings, and he literally personally raised the issue to prominence in the UN. Brilliant. He's a big loss.
Yeah. So I kind of want to go back to your personal experience, because you see the creation of UNAIDS, mm-hmm. and you see the Global Fund. Mm-hmm. Do you feel, what is your reflections thinking about and seeing those successes, right? Because you obviously had a very important part in shifting that perspective about taking HIV and AIDS as a very serious global health security issue. Tell me a little bit more about reflecting on that.
Well, the big problem, there are 2 big problems. One is, what is the best way forward to deal with the global pandemic of HIV/AIDS? What should we be doing? And the second one is, how are we going to pay for it? And what happened was, the reason we did the Global Fund is because it was controlled by the people who gave the money. When you give money to a UN program, you lose a lot of control. It's one country, one vote. With the exception of UNICEF, it's all of these UN agencies. It's one of the reasons why Trump pulled out of a WHO is, I need more votes than one vote, but the Constitution says one country, one vote. I'm 194th of the decision-making process. Nothing like that at all. So, and these global funds, Gavi and the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and TB, and all of that, the donors have a much bigger say in how the money's spent. So that's why there's this multiplicity of funds outside of the UN. It's because of the inherent democracy of the UN. And Congress is pretty insistent that it keeps track. For example, when UNAIDS was first created and the Global Fund was first created, you know, the United States wasn't allowed to give anything to the programs if they did any birth control related issues. They had to only talk about abstinence. So it became a real problem. And that was a big problem for PEPFAR. You remember at the beginning when they created PEPFAR, is the original money could not be used for anything, for any education other than abstinence training because of congressional funding rules.
Yeah. So I want to hone in on 2000 is a very important year. And you're talking about these key players, you know, Vice President Al Gore, and going in a forward direction on dealing with HIV and AIDS. So I kind of want to ask you, right, that in May 2000, the U.S. declared AIDS being a threat to American society. What did the news mean to you?
This is another good story, which is good to remember. That story was written by Bart Gellman, the Washington Post. You can look it up. I just looked it up the other day just for fun. He's a really great writer, by the way. Bart Gellman talked to somebody, not me, who said that the U.S. government considers HIV a national security issue. He called me up and he said, I'm publishing a story that the United States has declared HIV and AIDS as a national security issue. And I said, Bart, we haven't done that. And he said, well, here's my sources, and you're working on HIV AIDS, and the vice president just went up to the UN and talked about this at the Security Council. You can't deny it. So I went to my bosses, Sandy Berger, and to our public affairs person. And I said, here's what's going to happen. This story's coming out tomorrow or the next day. You better get ahead of this. And so they came out with a statement saying AIDS is a national security issue. Because Bart Gellman was just a good reporter. And it wasn't that they didn't want to see it that way, but they felt that a declaration implied actions that they weren't necessarily prepared to take, right? If you declare something a threat, then somebody says, okay, what are you going to do about it? But as long as it was in the background, it was easier to deal with on a piecemeal basis. But it worked out okay, because then Sandy Berger wrote an article, I think, for Foreign Affairs that basically said, you know, anything that crosses borders, kills millions, and destabilizes governments is by definition a national security issue. So he ended up speaking for the administration in a Foreign Affairs article, basically stating just that. So it was a big step forward. Bart Gellman did us a huge favor. At least did me a huge favor.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like you say, you know, this comes out, and I think one of the problems was, right, is like the money, right? Like who's going to pay for this? And now you have these big bodies competing, and once we have the money, how are we going to use the money, right? And going back to 2000, right, the 2000 election, you know, Bush wins. But I kind of want to hone in on President Clinton a little bit, because him reflecting on his experience, on his presidency, he regretted not doing more about the global pandemic during his term. How did you experience this?
Well, it was what I said previously. He did all the right things. He went to India. He raised HIV/AIDS wherever he could. He supported it whole hog. There was no doubt about that. The problem was funding. And Congress, and this is where the next administration hit a home run, because the next administration had people in it that knew how to deal with Republicans. The Clinton administration was a Democratic administration, and the people on a lot of the appropriations and foreign affairs committees were not. and they would block foreign aid programs, any foreign aid program, especially one that dealt with, you know, gay people, or, you know, there was still at that time, of course, a major concern that this was a disease of not everyday people, but of people who've made life choices that were not their life choices. So it was difficult to get funded. And I think the problem with remember, in the Reagan administration, Reagan never allowed the word HIV/AIDS to even be mentioned. And when C. Everett Koop sent out a letter to every American talking about HIV/AIDS, the White House never even commented on it, except to say that it wasn't from us. I mean, there was a real fear of HIV/AIDS being associated with the Republican Party back early on. And a lot of the people in Congress, you know, the Jesse Helmses of the world, have been around for a long time. And their constituents didn't like HIV/AIDS as an issue. So funding HIV/AIDS was very difficult in the Clinton years. What happened in the Bush years after the election changed everything.
Yeah. So the transition was, you know, very important and also very personal for you. You know, you were tasked with creating a transition memo. Can you talk about your feelings when you realized that your role was going to be dispensed with, but also as well the memo itself?
So the end of the Clinton administration, this was in the days of civility in administration transfers. The end of the administration, we were all asked at the NSC to write a 5-page memo on the issues that we were currently dealing with, the agreements that would overlap the administrations, you know, a country that was going to come in and talk about an issue that we were dealing with, or a budget issue that was in the middle of a budget cycle, something that would actually help the next administration move the agenda forward. And we were all, there was a transition team, and the NSC transition team at the time was headed by Philip Zelikow, who's a professor, I think, in Virginia, who has been in and out of administrations in the past. And we were all going to go meet with the transition team and brief them on our memos. And after a couple of weeks, everybody had said, yeah, I've already been down there and talked with them. I finally called up their administrative assistant. They had offices in the old executive office building. And I said, I haven't been called yet. And they said, oh, well, you're not going to be called. We don't need your memo. I said, why is that? And they said, well, these people don't think that health's a security issue. So I have the memo. It's here. I can show it to you. It was good. And it talked a lot about HIV/AIDS. It talked a lot about bioterrorism, something that I would spend a lot of time dealing with, smallpox, a lot of things that were clear national security issues. I mean, the Russians working with smallpox is not an insignificant issue. So that was it. So I was dispirited, and I was walking between the old executive office building and the West Wing, and who should be coming out of the West Wing was Donna Shalala, the secretary, coming from a goodbye party or something over there. And she said, what are you going to be doing? And I said, I don't know. I'm a career public health service officer. I was a rear admiral at the time, so I was going to have a job. And I said, I don't know, I'll go find something to do. I was career. And she said, you need to go work for a Republican. I said, we're going to have at least 4 years of a Republican making policy. You have been associated with Democrats for the last 8 years. You're going to have no policy saying anything unless you work for a Republican. And I said, what Republican? And she said, Bill Frist sits on the HELP committee, Health, Education, Labor Committee. I'm going to be introducing Tommy Thompson, the new health secretary, because we were both from Wisconsin. He had been the governor and she had been the chancellor of the university system there or something in previous life. And I'm going to be introducing him for confirmation tomorrow. And you need to go work for Bill Frist. He's a doctor and he's a conservative Republican. And I said, I've never met Bill Frist. And she said, go work for him. Until tomorrow, I can assign you there with a note. After tomorrow, I have no ability to do anything. And I'm out. It was the 21st of January, and inauguration day. And I said, but I've never met him. Why would I go work for him? And she said, just listen to me. Have I done you wrong before? And I said, okay. That afternoon, I got on my fax machine my new orders. I was a commissioned officer, so she was my boss. She could just detail me. She detailed me to Bill Frist's office. So I went over to Bill Frist's office, and the first thing he asked me to do was write funding legislation for HIV. And I said, I have never even seen legislation, much less how do you do it? And he said, see my legislative director, he'll tell you how to do it. And I learned how to write legislation in his office. It was just a wonderful gift she gave me, because at the end of a year, we wrote legislation for millions of dollars, extra dollars for foreign assistance. It died because the committee process wouldn't let it through, and it was Bill Frist just introduced the bill, and it didn't go through. But it taught me how Congress works and how legislation works and how appropriations works, which is even different. Great experience. And then 9/11 happened. So I had to go back to HHS to open an office of health security and defense and intelligence for Tommy Thompson, the new health secretary, because I had all the connections with the intelligence community and the defense community from my previous experience at the NSC. So I opened up an office for him at the time and left Bill Frist's office. Well, during that time, health had never had a connection with the White House Situation Room, a real-time SCIF, a secure room with video teleconferencing connections like every other security department in the US government does, so that you could have secure classified meetings without having to run down to the White House every time for every meeting. And so we opened up one of those, had it connected to the Situation Room, and we became part of the national security community, which was propitious because of the anthrax attacks that happened right after 9/11. And then suddenly, health was a security issue again, big time.
That's a good quick question. I want to know more about this moment when Bill Frist asked you to write
Yeah,
that
me too.
memo. I mean, you're going in with this really uncertain future, and you've never met him, and then he asked you to do something that seems so perfectly aligned with your interests. Can you talk about how that felt? How surprised you were?
Well, he was a really great guy. I really like him a lot to this day. He's a really terrific guy. He's very conservative, though. Second most conservative voting record in Congress at the time. And he was then, just after I left, he was made majority leader. Imagine a doctor, a cardiac surgeon from Tennessee, And he said, I'm only going to serve 2 terms and I'm gone. People shouldn't stay. This shouldn't be a career. This should be a contribution to the public service and leave. And he did it. I mean, how many people do that, right? So, a great guy. And he said, HIV/AIDS is an important security issue. I know, I'm a doctor. He used to work with groups in Africa. He probably mentioned when he talked to you that he worked with Samaritan's Purse, I think, and other groups of medical missionary groups in Africa. He was a pretty devout Christian. And he said, we need to do something here. And I said, okay, so I started writing the legislation. And I went to the ledge director, and they know how to do this, right? You write it out on yellow pads in plain English, and then you make an appointment with the legislative council. And these are lawyers who know how to turn it into what looks like legislation. And they're very hard to get an appointment with. They're very arrogant. They completely control everything because they're the only ones that can actually write it in legislative style. and that meets legal requirements. And at the time, they used word perfect instead of word. And so nobody used word perfect except legislative counsel. So you couldn't do anything except through them related to legislation. So we prepared the legislation, and Jesse Helms at the time was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he hated foreign aid. He hated foreign aid with a passion. He thought foreign aid was a waste of taxpayers' money. He didn't want anything to do with it. He tried to stop it any way he could. So I said, we can't get past Jesse Helms. This is an impossible situation. And he said, you leave Jesse Helms to me. And I said, you know how to do this? And he just laughed. And he said, this is Washington. Everybody has a soft spot here. And I know that the way we can deal with Jesse Helms. He said, find me a woman in Washington who has HIV, who has an HIV positive baby. So we talked with a bunch of people, and we found somebody up at Howard University. She was a student at Howard in Washington. And she had a baby who was HIV positive. And he says, I'm going to make an appointment for us all to go see Jesse Helms. And it's still pretty emotional. We went in to see Jesse Helms with this woman and her baby. And Jesse Helms was very polite, sitting behind his big desk and being very Jesse Helms-ish. And Bill Frist laid out the situation and said, there are thousands of women in Africa whose babies are going to die before their third birthday, like this one might, because we're not doing enough to prevent that. And Bill Frist took the baby and handed it to Jesse Helms. And Jesse Helms had tears in his eyes. And he said, Bill, this is unacceptable. Put me on the bill. I'll support you any way I can. It was a game changer. And I don't know whether Frist will take credit for it, but I was there. I saw it. Now, was that the sole thing that happened that made a change? No, that's not. PEPFAR, of course, had lots of fathers and mothers. But it made a huge change because we no longer had the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee saying no. Now, that particular bill didn't pass, but it was the precursor to bills that passed the next year and the next year that kept increasing the budget. And then, of course, when PEPFAR went through at $15 billion over 5 years, I guess it was 5 years, it paved the way for it. So that was, I think, Bill Frist's major contribution, was convincing Jesse Helms that this was the right thing to do. And that raises another issue, of course, when you're dealing with policy, which is there's an old saying that Democrats never met a group they didn't like or a person that they did, and Republicans never met a person they didn't like or a group that they did. And I think that what Bill Frist understood was that Republicans like Jesse Helms respond to real people sitting there talking to him, as opposed to a person with disabilities, not people with disabilities. And that the way to talk to him is not about the group, but about the individual case, the person with a name, the person with a real problem that has to be dealt with right here, right now. And he understood that. And he understood that the difference between talking to Democrats, if you went to see Ted Kennedy, it would be completely different. You had to talk about people with disabilities. You had to talk about the African populations with disabilities. The individual people, much less of an emotional connection. Now, I say that as a generalization. That's not completely true. But it's a way to approach how you promote policies with disparate worldviews.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It was a very beautiful memory and a very cherished memory. And I can only imagine you reflecting on it and how it makes you feel, and your importance to the push to get the funding to fight this very important public health
Now,
issue.
admittedly, that legislation went nowhere, but it changed the approach to funding international HIV/AIDS. It partially changed it enough to be able to make more progress in the next couple of years until PEPFAR was finally funded.
Yeah. And it was also, as you said, getting key policymakers like Jesse Helms on board, right? And Senator Frist was already on board. And reflecting on kind of this story, it's kind of the Secretary of State and the Senator had kind of like had this master plan almost, right? And that they tasked you and appointed you to be that person.
Well, I then made a split. When I went back to the White House, everything was about bioterrorism because of the anthrax attacks, right? And they didn't know who caused them. They initially thought it was an international attack on America, so it became a major national security issue. So I kind of parted with the whole HIV crowd right after 9/11 until later. Then because of the anthrax attacks and because I got then called back to the White House by Governor Tom Ridge. Governor Tom Ridge was called in by President George W. Bush to be his Homeland Security advisor. Not the department hadn't been created yet, but the advisor in-house. And Tom Ridge was a tall guy, and he was in a basement room with 7-foot ceilings that he almost touched. It was no windows, but it was in the West Wing, and it was an important job at the time because of the anthrax attacks in the powdered and the letters and such. And he decided that we needed back at the White House the Office of Health and Security, or Biodefense at the time, that was abolished when the administration a year earlier took office. So by coincidence, he called me up and said, "You know how to do this. You were in the last administration. Now that you worked for Bill Frist, we've already talked to Bill Frist's office, and he tells me that you're not a political liability." Donna Shalala was absolutely right. By going to work for Bill Frist, a serious Republican, and getting him to say, "No, Ken Bernard is not going to undermine your policies," I then became acceptable in the George W. Bush administration. How's that for political savviness on her part? So he calls me up and he says, "I need to interview you first." Turns out he interviewed me on the 1-year anniversary of 9/11, the first 1-year anniversary of 9/11 in 2002. And he had that morning been up to, because he was the governor of Pennsylvania, to do the ceremony where the plane crashed in Pennsylvania. You remember the one where the people on board brought it down? And he, again, tears in his eyes, having just spent that morning in Pennsylvania doing the memorial service for these people. And I, that day, happened to be, was it a Wednesday? I forget. I was wearing my uniform. And people in military don't, except for the Marines, don't wear uniforms in the White House very often. And so I went in and I was wearing a uniform at the time, and he had just come back from the ceremony, and I said, "It's a pleasure to be here. I'd be happy to, consider for the job." And I said, "Sorry, I'm wearing my uniform. I know it's not normal for the White House." He stood up and he said, "Don't ever apologize for that uniform. You're hired. You start tomorrow." That was it. That was the interview. So I opened an office of health and security at the White House again. Mostly we dealt with post 9/11 stuff, not HIV/AIDS. Mm-hmm. And we did that for some years. But as time went on, health and security became much more, it became influenza. What about natural outbreaks? It was just intentional outbreaks. What about natural outbreaks? And then the next big thing, of course, was bird flu or H1N1 flu. What about natural outbreaks that can cause problems? And it morphed much more into health as a security issue, including HIV/AIDS, including bioterrorism, including vaccine availability, including price of drugs. All of that kind of get folded back in. like it was in the early Clinton administration. The difference was that in 2003, the president, well, before 2003, actually, it was in 2002, decided that he wanted to do something on HIV/AIDS. And he had the idea for a big program, and he tasked several people at the White House and Tony Fauci to create a big program, the PEPFAR program, and to do it in secret because he didn't want everybody else's opinion. He wanted a few people he trusted to come up with an idea and to present it in a way that would make it very difficult to undermine.
How did you keep, and again, this might not have happened, but how did you keep the global HIV/AIDS agenda in the conversation in 2002? You know, working with maybe Bush or not?
We didn't. By that time, the UN AIDS program had been created. There was the global program for AIDS and malaria and TB, which was just being funded, just being stood up. There was lots of international interest, and there were drugs. So the issues became treatment affordability, and that was being dealt with by USAID, not so much the White House.
So, and I might be getting my times wrong, but, you know, there was these initiatives that happened, the prevention of transmission from mother to child, and then obviously, you know, PEPFAR, but to what extent were the NSC and NSC staff advising on these? Like, were there, and who were some of the major players?
Well, in the Clinton administration, it was Gail Smith, who was the director of the Africa office. Now, Gail is a personality. And at the time, she was working with Susan Rice, who was the Assistant Secretary for Africa at State Department. So they basically had a lock on Africa and HIV/AIDS. Sandra Thurman was there. She wasn't as impactful internationally as the two of them. You know, Susan Rice, of course, national security, you know, is her middle name, and Gail Smith had been around for years doing aid assistance to Africa, and she was actually early in her career a journalist and lived in Africa for years, a real pro on Africa. So nobody really got in their way. So they basically were running it as a smaller portfolio in their larger sets of issues. It did not have really its own home at the NSC.
And were these folks still kind of like informing these policies, right, during the Bush administration? Or was it more like asking for suggestions, et cetera, et cetera?
No, in the Bush administration, it all disappeared for the first year. Mm-hmm. I mean, the White House involvement was peripheral. Mm-hmm. It was led by USAID mostly, CDC, and you know, the components of their assistance programs. There was a lot of money at USAID for AIDS at the time. Not a lot, but hundreds of millions of dollars. So it was mostly focused on as an aid program, like the malaria initiative, or you know, any number of initiatives related to international health and development assistance. Mm-hmm. It wasn't so much a policy issue until PEPFAR.
Okay. So now I want to go into the specifics about PEPFAR. And again, feel free to add if I may have missed something. But, you know, you were aware of Bush, or maybe not aware of Bush, working this with a very few close people. Did you have any idea of those conversations, or when did you first hear about PEPFAR?
It's pretty funny, actually. It was, you know, Gary Edson, I think, was involved, and of course Tony Fauci, and a couple of other people very close to the Domestic Policy Council, people that close to the president. I heard about PEPFAR. I knew there were rumors about it. I was pretty sure, because I knew Tony Fauci well, that he was working on something, but the actual PEPFAR announcement that was going to be in the State of the Union in 2003, I found out about the day before.
Wow.
And I was pretty, I was in the Situation Room every other day. I was in the White House. This was not somebody out in a peripheral agency. Operational security was unbelievable. Just like when they created the Department of Homeland Security and nobody knew about it until they announced it. It was all done in the PEOC, the bomb shelter under the East Wing of the White House. They kept pretty good security on it. It was announced to us by Tony. We were all meeting to talk about the State of the Union because at the time, the president was announcing not only PEPFAR, but also BioShield, which I wrote. BioShield was to protect Americans against bio-threats like anthrax by advance appropriating $5.6 billion to entice pharmaceutical companies to create countermeasures against biologic threats for which there was no commercial value. Who needs a treatment for anthrax? Nobody gets anthrax in the United States. It's a rare disease. So how are you going to stockpile treatments for anthrax if a foreign power decided to attack America with anthrax? You can't. A private company was not going to invest in that. So we created a fund to pay for that, which got people to actually create the countermeasures against biothreats. But the second thing that it did was it created the emergency use authorization. There were 3 titles in this legislation, the BioShield legislation. The one for the funding, the emergency use authorization, which you may notice was used for all of the drugs and vaccines for COVID and has been used in many times as since that time, was originally created to protect the companies against lawsuits and blame for the use of a product that was not licensed. Because how could you create a product against, say, anthrax and license it without doing a bunch of studies that nobody was going to pay for? And besides, you can't really legitimately do anthrax challenge studies on people and that kind of thing, right? So it became very difficult. So the emergency use authorization was originally created to deal with protecting companies that were creating new products that might need to be used in an emergency attack on the United States with a biologic agent. Well, how this gets back to PEPFAR is the State of the Union in 2003 was being written, and it included an entire page of the State of the Union was on health issues. Never had happened before in anybody's memory. Literally, a page of the State of the Union had 2 issues in it: the creation of PEPFAR and the creation of a program to defend America against biologic attack. And that was with the BioShield bill and other associated legislation. The president talked for 2 or 3 minutes about health issues. Was never happened before. It's where health as a national security issue became set in stone. You can't argue against it anymore. And PEPFAR, by the way, was, of course, made a big splash, but at the time, people were still scared about being attacked with a biologic weapon because the anthrax letters were sent to some very important people and journalists. People were quite concerned about their letters and, white powder incidents and all of that. So it was, at the time, pretty much equally considered as important issues, which was good for us.
Mm-hmm. So these were multiple issues that are very pressing and important to your life. You were part of BioShield leading that, but also as well, HIV and AIDS is personal to your professional career, and PEPFAR and getting a whole page devoted to it on the State of the Union. How did that make you feel?
Like the last 25 years were worthwhile. I mean, when you're working on things like this, it's really hard to see results, right? They're iterative and they're structural and they're slow. Moving health out of the humanitarian, solely humanitarian side. Rich Western or Northern countries need to give things to the Southern countries because they're poor and they need support. True, but that's not the whole thing. And getting people to view health as a security issue, not just security against foreign attack by people with malintent, but COVID. How could you have any more of a national security issue than COVID? No. I mean, right now they're still arguing about whether China created it or they leaked from the laboratory or it's a natural outbreak. This was a national security issue. It shut down our economy. It had a huge impact. It's very difficult to get the two tribes, the public health tribe, the national security tribe, to see themselves as having an overlapping Venn diagram. They, to this day, don't like it, but they can't ignore it anymore. And I think that was what made me, it's like coming from the bioterrorism side and the HIV/AIDS side and vaccine affordability, lots of other things that I did when I was working on this, it became evident that we had too narrow a view of our international relationships related to public health and health issues, that we needed to expand the juris of international health to include things that made both the national security people and the public health people uncomfortable.
I wanted to ask you about, you're doing very, very extremely important work during that 2003. Did you keep up with PEPFAR trying to make its way through Congress? And maybe you did, maybe you didn't. You can elaborate on that. And were you aware of some of the key players trying to push that through?
Well, let's see. Mark Dybel, if you haven't talked with him, you need to talk with him. He was a key player. There were a lot of key players, Gary Edson, lots of other people that were quite involved. What was nice is that PEPFAR went to the State Department, because that showed you that it was a policy issue, not just a development assistance issue. And I think that's critical. USAID is a development assistance agency, and they provide tremendous benefit. It's a disaster that it's been eliminated by this administration, in my opinion, because not everything that you do has policy implications. Sometimes it's just the right thing to do. Saving babies who would otherwise die is part of being an American. It doesn't have to agree with your policy. It's just the right thing to do. And USAID did a lot of that. They were fabulous. But they didn't cover all of the policy-related issues related to health and security. They notoriously argued with CDC all the time about who was in charge and whose ideas were the right ones and all of that. And I think the idea of putting PEPFAR at the State Department and making an envoy for international health security and head of the PEPFAR program was the right way to go. I think we need to consider international AIDS, PEPFAR and all, in a broader context than just another aid development assistance program, and they did that. Luckily, and just barely, I think PEPFAR's funding has been saved by, I think, Susan Collins, over the last month. It was all going to be abolished in their attempt to save money. Really short-sighted.
Yeah. So were you aware of some of the key concerns of the legislators at the time? You were involved with creating the legislation for the precursor, right, of PEPFAR.
Well, the big problem was the political problem. This was a Republican administration, and there's about the Mexico City rule and all of that, the idea that the U.S. government doesn't support abortion in any organization, anywhere. There was a lot of problems with family planning. There was a huge component of the original PEPFAR program that included abstinence training. And the public health people kept saying, you know, you can't tell African teenagers they can't have sex. I mean, you can't tell any teenager they can't have sex. You can try, but it's not going to make a public health impact. And it became a problem in that a certain percentage of the money allocated to PEPFAR had to be used for abstinence training, which the public health people just almost couldn't deal with. But I thought it was fine. I mean, if you could get Jesse Helms to agree to something and just spend $25 million a year or whatever it was on abstinence training, fine. It's like a tax. The tax on the program to get it passed was to pay $25 million off the top to satisfy somebody who you need to pass it. It's just what you do. Mm-hmm. It's like when the BioShield bill was put together, it was Judd Gregg from New Hampshire and Ted Kennedy, guys that were at the opposite ends of the political spectrum. And so what happened over time was the actual legislation reflected their opposite poles and compromises that were made. The same thing happened with funding of PEPFAR, and I think it's perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. The public health people, though, being public health people, just gritted their teeth. It just drove them crazy to do that. But they got religion eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, your experience and your trajectory as a career in, you know, working with the Peace Corps and all these really personal relationships, like, I think helped you see that, right? Because, you know, you worked in the Clinton administration and you worked in the Bush administration. And as you said, right, it's kind of like, I'm okay with, you know, like behavior change stuff as long as we can get like that money, right? That was really one of the major key issues, right, at that time.
Yeah. I wrote an article for Nature a couple of years ago talking about the difference between science and policy. And people don't understand that. Public health people especially don't understand that science is not policy. Science informs policy. And in some cases, like vaccine recommendations, it probably informs 80% of policy. In other things like wearing masks, it informs 10% of policy. The rest of it is policy. The rest of it takes in consideration if you, for example, during COVID, if you were to send kids home from school, the non-science part of that, you might decrease the kids' chances of transmitting a disease, but who's going to take care of the kids after they go home? And if you're the mayor of a city or the governor of a state, you can't ignore that part. That's part of policy making. And scientists, especially public health scientists, have a tendency to say, that's not important. What's important is saving lives and making sure there's no transmission in the schools. And you say, yeah, it is. But are you planning on babysitting these kids? Mm-hmm. And they go, well, that's not my problem. Well, whose problem is it? Well, it's those other people's problems. Okay, don't you think the governor needs to consider those people too, just like he has to consider you? Yes, but we're talking life and death here. You get those conversations a lot. And back when I first started in the Clinton administration at the White House, I was told flat out health is not a security issue by the World Health Organization people and the CDC people, that it is you are going to ruin public health in America if you do that. It is the wrong paradigm. It's counter to everything that's good. And we had to fight that for years until one national security related health issue popped up after another that they couldn't push back much anymore.
Mm-hmm. So you're getting at these very contentious issues that were in the debates of the creation of PEPFAR. Mm-hmm. Did you follow the different reauthorizations of the program? Like, what were your thoughts about these processes and their debates? And they might be kind of elaborations on what you've already talked about.
No, I really wasn't involved in that because that was then done by the head of PEPFAR at at the State Department. Now when, what was her name? They had a PEPFAR back then. Debbie Burks. Not my favorite person. I think she underperformed for what her job title was. She, and then she got called to the White House to do COVID, and she did even worse there. I know she was one of Tony's acolytes, and all, you know, one of her, he was her mentor and all of that. But I just didn't think she did a good job. And the reason is because she was a numbers person. She was an old-fashioned demography/epidemiologist. If it couldn't be put in a chart, it wasn't interesting. If it couldn't be, you couldn't make it a number. If you couldn't turn it into a table, I don't trust it. And a lot of this stuff is not quantifiable.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it is emotional, a lot of it, like wearing masks, right? I mean, or
taking care of your kid.
exactly,
having to go to
or
work.
having to take care of your child because they can't go to school and you have to go to work. What do? You can't afford a sitter. So I think and she spent a lot of time doing that. And part of her job title included ambassador for health security issues. I forget the exact title at the State Department. But she never really promoted that. She never turned public health into another foreign policy priority for the State Department. She just managed the PEPFAR program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I didn't really care much about her management of the PEPFAR program. Congress told them how much they could spend, and they spent it on mostly the right things. But I had bigger fish to fry.
Yeah.
I thought.
Yeah. I want to kind of talk about, in the name of PEPFAR, the word emergency is in PEPFAR, in the
Mm-hmm.
acronym. Can you tell me about the importance of conceiving the pandemic at that time as an emergency in 2003? Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, sure. PEPFAR was very cleverly created to do what we started doing back with Bill Frist and started doing before PEPFAR was actually created. And that was to convince the public health people that the best dollar spent isn't just prevention. If you go to a village in Africa and you want people to listen to you, the best thing to do is to treat the people in their family that are dying of HIV. Because before the drugs, you had, those people all died. If you had HIV, there was no hope. You would eventually get an infection and die. I forget the number of years on average, but it's not very many. And those people all had kids. Sexually active people usually have kids. All those kids were uncared for. Grandparents took care of them. Villages were filled with young people and old people and nobody in between. Terrible situation. And so what happened, and where the Republicans and the Bush administration made a huge difference, going back to Frist, is they said, wait a minute, we need to change the paradigm for assistance to include treatment, because that's going, even though treatment's expensive, it's how we're going to get people to listen. If you take a family and you say, your dad has HIV, he's soon going to die, we think. We don't have anything we can give them. And they say, but they're treating people in America and in Europe, and they're saving their lives. And they say, yes, but it's too expensive. So what happened with PEPFAR is, because of the amount of money involved, they could negotiate pricing of drugs down to what was potentially feasible to use in Africa. And when they then went into villages and said, you need to quit having unprotected sex, and oh, by the way, part of the deal here is we're going to treat your parents, or we're going to treat you. Suddenly, people felt listened to. I mean, lecturing, rich people lecturing you about your behavior is not a fast way to have them pay attention. Doing the lecture At the same time, you're giving them drugs that make them better and feel better, is a win-win situation. And so with the amount of money in PEPFAR, they got the price of the drugs that were available at the time down to an amount that, while it didn't treat everybody, they could go in and actually treat substantial numbers of people. So they selected where they would treat in a very narrow way to make sure that they didn't they could treat people for as long as they needed to be treatment, which in this case is lifetime. So, it was a difficult problem. But goodness sakes, they've been treating people now for years. And I haven't been in detail looking at the reappropriations year after year, but at the beginning, they couldn't spend $3 billion a year or whatever it was. I guess it was $3 billion a year for 5 years was the initial appropriation. They kept saying, we can't spend that much. We haven't set up the programs yet. But eventually, they did. And it was probably George W. Bush's greatest accomplishment, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So we've covered a lot of ground about your career and HIV/AIDS and PEPFAR and that very important pivot of taking public health as a national security concern. I want to ask some of the concluding reflections as we're kind of, winding down the interview. As you reflect on PEPFAR, how do you find that PEPFAR influenced your thinking about public health or global development?
It indicated a couple of things. One is leadership matters. This only happened because President Bush said, this is going to happen. Leadership matters. And it didn't happen under Clinton, even though he was even better at summarizing the issues and why they're important, because he did not have the ability to get the funding. When George W. Bush, who was a Republican, dealt with a anti-foreign aid Republican Congress and had Bill Frist there as majority leader, and the right leadership can get things done. And secondly, they quit being so doctrinaire about how foreign aid money should be spent. And Republicans like treatment. As I was saying, they want to see somebody get better. They want to know that John Wilson got better from what I spent the money on. Not that 0.2% of people that would have died now lived in Kenya. That's not an argument that appeals to everybody. They want to actually see somebody who actually survived. And PEPFAR saw to that part of the problem. It saw to actually providing health care to countries that couldn't afford it or didn't have the wherewithal to provide it. And it showed that America cared. And say what you want about George Bush, he personally cared. Mm-hmm. And he's gone back to Africa since to work on cervical cancer issues in Africans. He never talks about it. He just does it. Mm-hmm. Great guy. I liked him a lot.
So we're taking this from a quote from Emily Bass's book. And in that book, you're quoted as saying, quote, PEPFAR, its success is illustrative, but not a structural example. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
It isn't in and of itself. It solved a problem in a very effective way for that problem. And it illustrates what leadership, funding, and focus can do. But every transnational health issue has a different set of problems. Malaria is not the same as HIV/AIDS. Smallpox was not the same. They eradicated smallpox by doing ring immunization around cases. So there was a different way of doing it. They eradicated a disease that killed 500 million people in the 20th century by a completely different program than was used for dealing with HIV/AIDS. So it's illustrative of the principles that you need to consider if you're going to do a big program. But it's not a structure that would apply to global public health issues. That's kind of what I was getting at. There's a little bit of a brief quote there, but hopefully the actual, what she said in the book, I haven't read that part.
That's okay. I mean, I think it's very important, right? Because you don't want to generalize, right? Especially responses to different public health emergencies and situations,
Well,
right?
it's, you, number one, need leadership, and number two, you need to listen to the people who are affected. What do they want? What do they need? And quit determining what they need based on somebody's PhD thesis done at Harvard.
Yeah, yeah. So many Americans, don't know about PEPFAR. Why do you think that is? And what are the political, social importances, in your opinion, of understanding what it did and accomplished?
First off, it saved, I don't know what the estimates are, 25 million people that were saved by PEPFAR. That's all, that's enough. I think, how many other things have we done that have had that much potential impact on people's real lives? And this is George W. Bush. George W. Bush is not interested in getting awards, in people saying, PEPFAR, George W. Bush's PEPFAR program is the greatest thing since sliced bread. That's not him. Most people don't know that he's still working on African health issues. He doesn't advertise it. He doesn't take reporters on trips with him to Africa so that he can get in the New York Times. He's just a decent guy. And I think what he did with PEPFAR, the only reason PEPFAR exists is George W. Bush. He said, I want it. I want a big program. I want it well funded, and I want it now. And he was president. Mm-hmm. And I think people underestimate that. And he doesn't care whether people say, oh, PEPFAR, it was created by George W. Bush. Isn't it great? It needs to go down in history as the greatest thing. He just wanted to do it. And that's why you don't hear about it much, right? He doesn't talk about it. Although if you go to Africa and you ask them who's the greatest president in a lot of countries, American president, they'll tell you George W. Bush. Lots of people tell you that. And it's because he actually went over there, did something, didn't do it for his own purposes. He didn't advance his political agenda, particularly in America. It wasn't intended as a promotion of his status in America, unlike so many other senior leaders do, where it's all about them. He just did it because he thought it was the right thing to do. Now, I know that for sure. I was there. I saw him. I watched the way he did all this stuff. The fact that he didn't publicize it very much. He just went out there and saved a bunch of people and did it on his watch and said it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. So,
and I'm not even a big Republican, by the way. This is not, I haven't seen George Bush since a reunion I went to last year, NSC reunion, where I saw him for the first time in 10 years. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So before, I asked the last question, did you want to follow up on anything, Susan? No? Okay. So is there anything that you feel I may have missed, which you would like to further discuss?
I think people today, 2025, need to pay attention to PEPFAR because it actually is the best dollar spent. And I think people need to continue to fund it, and they need to not put ideological labels on it. It's not a Democratic initiative. It's not a Republican initiative. It's not a foreign aid initiative. It's an American initiative. And the president, as representing America, created something that has made a huge impact on real people. And I think we ought to be proud to be Americans that we were around when it happened.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
That it?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.